Hello and welcome to Fall Through, your source for deep conversations about software, technology, and computing. I'm your host, Chris Brando, also known as Scriptable, and today it is another duo, maybe trio, we'll see, episode of me and Steve, and we are going to talk about a couple of topics. The first one we're going to talk about is JJ. You know, with all of the news about Git and GitHub, well, mostly GitHub, having availability issues, people are looking for an alternative, and Steve happens to work on, or work for a company that's working with said alternative. So we're going to have a conversation about that. If you haven't heard of JJ, we're going to get into what it is and how to use it and all of that. And then, as always, we're going to have some fun AI content because it's related to what Steve's working on, and just, you know, there's always so much stuff going on in the news. We are posting a lot on social media, so if you do not follow us there and you love getting extra fall through content, you should follow us on social media. It would help us out a ton. If you don't really watch stuff on social media, you should give us a follow anyway. It helps us. We love followers. And if you're watching on YouTube, you should hit that like and subscribe button. That helps us out a lot. And with that, let's get into the show. Hello, viewer / listener. Welcome to another episode number 70. So this is officially our 71st episode because we are zero indexed, which is always the episode number always tells you how many we have shipped, which is nice. I like that property of being zero indexed. And hopefully, if I did everything right, you'll see some new branding. So we're doing a nice little brand refresh, some new assets that will make my life a whole lot easier. I was prototyping them earlier this week. I think they look really good, but let us know what you think, especially what you think of the new color scheme. It does still look a lot like our old branding, but it's been refreshed, updated. But we're not here to talk about Fall Through's brand. We did that last week. We're here to talk about JJ and AI with our wonderful co-host, Steve. Steve, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm doing all right. You know, it's a nice day in New York. I think it was like 80 yesterday.
Nice.
So it was very, very warm, and I appreciate this warm weather. I don't like them to have to start using air conditioning more. That part I don't like.
Yeah.
But other than that, I like the warm weather. We're almost to summer, so I'm excited about that. But
it's terribly rainy and dreary down here in Austin right now, so it's just kind of how it goes. But it'll be unbearably hot soon enough, and so it's fine. Yeah, those Texas summers can be brutal. It's Texas is dry heat mostly, right? It really depends on where you're at, because part of Texas is on the coast, and so if you're on the coast, then it's really muggy. But over here in Austin or in Dallas, it's not too bad. But okay. Houston and Corpus and stuff like that are much more humid.
Okay. Yeah, I don't mind hot. I just don't like hot and humid because I don't need it to feel like I'm walking through water when I go outside.
Yeah.
That happens in the city sometimes. It's just I'm I didn't want to be able to drink the air sort of vibes. Hopefully this summer we'll not have many of those days. Hopefully we'll stay in the 80s, maybe low 90s, but I don't have hopes. There's going to be some of those scorchers, and I'm going to be staying inside the whole time.
Yeah.
But all right, let's get started with the first topic of today, which is JJ. I think we've talked about JJ a few times on the podcast. I think most of the other hosts use JJ. I'm still an old curmudgeon using Git, typing in my Git commands, being like, you'll probably get out of my cold dead hands sort of situation. But I'm definitely interested in JJ. It's mostly I have too many new tools I'm learning right now. I don't have bandwidth to add another one that will be fundamental to my workflow. But I think it's important that people understand these alternative tools because, you know, they'll be out there, and and JJ looks like it's getting a lot of popularity. It looks like it will be one of the big alternatives to Git in the future. It's not even really an alternative because you can use it with Git, which I think is one of the amazing parts. But let's start out with just, describing what JJ is and I guess maybe why it exists, if you can get into that a bit.
Totally. So you'll sometimes see JJ called Jujutsu, and I like to just say JJ because the name sort of comes from the fact that JJ is easy to type on the keyboard, and then they sort of backfilled the Jujutsu name out of it, and so I just find JJ to be a little easier to say, and so but you hear it called Jujutsu because it's technically the project's name. But it comes to us from a side project from this guy named Martin, who works at Google, and basically he was on the Mercurial steering committee and is just like a guy who really cares a lot about version control stuff. And so he sort of started working on what would this like a new version control system be that would like learn from both Git and Mercurial and like come up with something that's, like Git's 20 years old, 25 years old, whatever now. And so, naturally there will be tools to come later. And so what would something designed for now look like as opposed to something that was designed back then? And so it kind of like grew out from there. And then now it's got a very, I like to describe the relationship between JJ and Google in the same way that early Rust and Mozilla was, where like it's not JJ is not a Google project, but it is like some Googlers work on it, and there's a lot of maintainers who are not at Google as well, but like it does have some degree of institutional backing from Google because you can actually use it with Google's Mono-Repo today inside of Google on Linux at least. I haven't heard if it's been other platforms as well, but like they do care about it, and the plan is to make it the default sort of like source control solution at Google. So it's got some like real world testing and usage. And then it's like kind of interesting too, because as you hinted at, like while JJ is its own version control system, it's got its own like pluggable backends. And so in the open source world, the backend that you use is the Git backend, which means that JJ knows how to speak Git's protocol, and it knows how to write to and from Git's files on the file system. And so you can kind of use JJ as an alternate front end for Git if you want to. Or like with Google, they have a backend for Piper, their VCS thing. And so you can also sort of use it in other ways. And so I think that's a really critical property of it, because like that's the only reason I was able to give it a try, is because you can use JJ and everyone else on your team can use Git, and nobody needs to know that you're using JJ. Like it can be truly just a personal preference. And so that's like really super helpful, because, I mean, when I first started using this like 2 years ago, the idea of choosing something other than GitHub was like a big negative. And obviously GitHub is having some problems now, and so people are a little more open to that than they usually are. But like it's still the case that like if your job uses GitHub and you need to collaborate with stuff on Git, you can't convince your entire team to move over to JJ necessarily. And so there's got to be like a path forward there. And so that's like a really nice aspect of like adopting and trying it out. And it's also true because if you use it a little bit and you don't like it, you could just stop using it and you still have your Git repo. So it's like makes it really easy to give it a try and see what you think.
Yeah, that's one of the aspects of it that I've really liked, that I think is likely what's going to make it successful, if it becomes successful, is the fact that like you don't have to change your entire stack like some other things would require you to do, which gives a nice little also natural on-ramp for like if one person starts and then you get a few more people, and then you get a few more people, and then all of a sudden you have enough people that it's like, okay, maybe we can actually switch to something that is like more native if we have like a giant mono-repo. Although not a lot of people have giant mono-repos, they have sizable mono-repos, but still in general working with mono-repos in Git is frustrating. Yeah. So and obviously Google's VCS does not work at all like it does, because they have so much code in their monorepo. Yeah. So that's another nice aspect of it. It can work with a diverse set of things. And does it work with stuff like Tangled as well, or is that just kind of more off in the future?
So Tangled actually has a lot of so because JJ is its own VCS, it still will do some stuff that like with some Git features that are maybe not as like widely used in other places yet so far. So one of the core ideas in JJ is that you don't just have your commit ID, you also have what's called a change ID. And this like basically you can kind of almost think of a change as like a branch, but it's also not sort of a branch. Kind of the idea is that like, because Git is sort of content addressed, whenever you make a change to a commit, then its commit ID changes, right? So if you amend a commit, then you get a new one. And so JJ would really like to like present you with a stable identifier over time. So there's kind of this conceptual idea of a change ID, and it is always the same. And then when you modify one of those changes, it produces a new commit. And so that will then change to the new commit hash, but your change ID stays the same. And that way you can sort of like have these more stable identifiers when you're trying to modify things, because JJ is a little more mutable than Git in the sense that like, immutable data structure is like immutable, which just means that like you make mutations by making a new one and then changing what the pointer points to, kind of thing. So so it is still fully immutable in the sense that like you're making new Git commits when you change something, just like you would in Git. If you amend it, it just makes a new commit. But the difference is that like JJ understands the progression of how a commit evolves over time. Because it knows all of the like historical commits that would be associated with changing that thing. So anyway, it's got this change ID. And so to keep track of that, it writes that into a header in all the Git objects. And so most Git commands support those headers, but some of them don't. And so like if you end up rebasing a commit with Git, like it won't actually preserve all those headers because this like feature of Git is like a little interesting at times. And so like Tangled is able to read those change IDs out of the Git IDs natively. And so if you ever used Gerrit, like Gerrit makes you put a trailer in the actual commit message. And that's because that'll be guaranteed that doesn't actually go away because it's in the commit message. So there's actually been some discussion between the JJ folks and the Gerrit folks and the Git Butler folks about supporting putting that change ID sort of natively in the commit header itself, or at least having Gerrit understand that, so there can be an interoperability, because also the formats they use are slightly different. But the point is there's like a bunch of other tooling, that even like more native Git based tooling, that's kind of interested in this concept, and it's been brought up on the Git mailing list as well. And so anyway, back to the original actual point of this question, Tangled, like they're fans of JJ as well, and so they're building native support sort of on top of Git as well, so that you can like have that kind of concept, and they're doing stack PRs and all that kind of thing. So it's definitely a pleasant experience to use JJ with something like Tangled.
Right. Yeah, that's Gerrit is like always an interesting example, I think, of things, because it's like I've been a big fan of Gerrit for a very long time. I used it for a couple of years, like it was the main thing that we were committing into. I found it like such a better experience than GitHub PRs in like almost every way. And I think it's that change ID was one of the big things, because I was like, oh, I'm working on like a thing that I'm building over time, instead of it being like a series of objects that I'm building, right? It kind of wiped away that implementation detail that was like the immutability of Git, and gave you like a lot. I think you get a lot of features from just having that stable ID across things, where it's like, okay, now I can completely rebase the thing. I can see the whole history when I'm reviewing. It knows like where I last was, so I can see everything from that commit to this one. Which I think is another really nice feature. And I'm glad that JJ is getting integrated more with Gerrit and with things like Tangled, because I think Tangled is also an interesting idea. For, I guess, a little tangent for those that don't know what Tangled is, can you give like a quick little explanation of it?
Yeah. So Tangled is a federated implementation of a Git server. So like, what if GitHub was not just one host, but a bunch of them? And it's built on top of the AT Proto ecosystem, which is what Blue Sky works off of. But so you can like log into Tangled with your Blue Sky account, and then create projects, and they can be saved. It doesn't save them like in your PDS, if you know what that is. If you're a Blue Sky nerd, it creates these servers called knots, and so they host one, but you can also host your own, and then you can have those join the federation. And so that's where the repo state is actually stored. But all of the sort of like social layer is stored inside of your PDS. So like, if you want to follow developers that you follow on Blue Sky, you can do that on Tangled pretty easy, because it knows who you follow on Blue Sky and that kind of thing. But yeah, so it's and they've got some VC funding, and they're kind of building it out, but it's like primarily focused on public repos at the moment, because Blue Sky is currently only has public data, but it's kind of this like federated version of GitHub kind of.
Okay. Yeah. No, it's cool. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening in this space, which is very exciting.
Yeah. I think it's just healthy in general. We've been living through a monoculture for the last 10 or 15 years. And so I think that that like as much as GitHub has been a very, very meaningful part of my life, and like it's very important to me, and it's sad to see the current state that it's in, it's also, I think, just more healthy that there's not, as I said a little earlier, like a couple years ago, it was sort of unthinkable to big a project not on GitHub because that's where everybody was, and the sort of like social pull is so strong whenever that's sort of assumed. And so I think that like getting developers exposed to the idea that there are more hosts and other ways of doing things is just like good for us collectively. So while I am sad to see what's happening with GitHub, I am excited to see that there's multiple sort of viable alternatives springing up in its place.
Yeah, because back when Git first came out, there was like Git, and there was Mercurial, and there was Bazaar, and there was like a couple. There was like Fossil. There was like a little bit of an ecosystem, and Git just kind of ate everybody's lunch. I don't think Mercurial is still kind of kicking around because of Facebook, but
yeah, I mean that's forked into Sapling now, and so but this is an important part of the story, and like not to like totally switch into what my job is doing, but like there's a really interesting part too where I think JJ might be important because like so the biggest FANG companies tend to do stuff differently than the rest of the industry because they have different needs, and one of those is version control. And so like both Google and Meta both kind of ended up with forks of Mercurial instead of going with Git, because Git has some like fundamental scaling properties because it was designed primarily for the Linux kernel, which many people would describe as large, but if you've ever worked at one of these companies, you would describe it as small. And so there's some decisions that were made in the way that Git works that kind of like don't make it suitable for truly large repos. And those are really hard to work around. And so while it's gotten better than it was at the point where this decision was made, like both of those two companies at the very least decided to go with Mercurial instead because of various reasons around that kind of thing. And so they both have sort of kind of like split off from base Mercurial. Like at Google, there's Piper, which is Perforce compatible because Google was using Perforce for a while, and then Meta turned into Sapling, which is like its own little kind of like fork of Mercurial as well. So there's a lot of like like interesting ways in which that stuff goes, and because JJ has these pluggable backends, the fact that you can use it with Git when you get going, and then once you hit the fundamental sort of scaling limitations of Git and you need something else, means that it's nice that your client can stay the same while you transition from one of those things to the other in the back end. Like in the same thing that lets you use JJ with a Git repo now, it means if you need to move away from Git to something else in the future, you've still learned the same client and it can work the same way whenever you sort of change the back end. And so, yeah, like in theory, if the customers or the employees at your company are all using JJ, it means that you're kind of free to move off of Git to something else if something else serves your needs. And so I think that like transition story is kind of really, really cool. There's tons of stuff like this that I wish there was better, like stuff that works in the big and in the small, because like build systems, for example, like. So back to JJ stuff. Yeah. So like the thing about JJ that's interesting is that it, in some ways okay. So to me, the way I've been describing why I love it so much is that it is just as powerful as Git, but it's also easier. And there's very few things that are both of those things at the same time. Usually you get one or the other, right? You like, as we're just talking about with the scale up, scale down thing, the easy thing works in the small and the complicated thing works in the large. And so you kind of like have to accept complexity to move up. But like, I think that JJ ends up like being both simpler and more powerful than Git. And what I mean by this is like the way it's possible for that to happen is that JJ has fewer concepts than Git and they're better factored. And so this means that like you end up having a certain degree of simplicity. That doesn't mean you're giving up your actual power. And so what I mean by that is like more specifically is like JJ does not have a index. It doesn't have a staging area. And so that's a thing that when I first heard this, I was like, cool, well, I love Git's index, so this tool is not for me. And if that was your reaction to me saying this, I totally get it. But the deal is that the staging area is a workflow pattern that you can choose to adopt in JJ as opposed to a mandatory feature. And so because so let me explain what I mean by that. So in JJ, because commits are like more mutable than they are in Git. Like it's totally fine to create a commit and then modify it afterwards because, as I mentioned before, you kind of get this history of how the commit was modified over time. What you end up doing is if you like the index and you want to do that kind of thing as a strategy, you make a new empty commit and then you make a new empty commit on top of it. And then you do your work in that second one. And whenever you're ready to do the equivalent of like git add -p, you run JJ squash, which is a command that moves part of a diff from one commit into another one. By default, it's parent. And so you kind of squash your changes into that empty parent and build it up over time. And so you're kind of like working on the commit that's above you rather than working on the commit that you're actually on. And so you can still build that up to be exactly what you want. And you can have all the stuff that you don't want in your sort of working copy commit. But like this means now that like you get the same exact benefits, but we've eliminated an entire sort of concept. And it's like, well, why does that matter? Well, the first thing is it reduces complexity. So the fact that git reset has --hard, --soft, and --mixed is because all those flags interact with, well, what do I do with the index and the working copy that are separate from the commit itself? And since there's sort of no separation between working copy, index, and commit, all of the commands that JJ has are much more orthogonal because they just work on commits. Like there's no need for that extra state. And so that means that those commands all have a better UX. But it also means you gain more power because now like I can do things that that are nonsense in Git that I can do in JJ. Like you can rebase your working copy onto another commit if you want to. And like, is that particular command useful? Like probably not. But like the important part is all of the sort of like slice and dicing commits, like tools that you have, you can now use those on your index or on your working copy since those are just regular old commits now. And so it means that like everything is more orthogonal and therefore ends up being more powerful. And it's the same thing with the stash. So like stashing something in Git is something that I would use occasionally, but stashes in Git have like a linked list of stashes. Like you can continue to make that stash, but I would never use those because it's really easy to get confused about what's in there and stuff. And so a stash in JJ is just make a new commit on top of my parent. And so now you've like have your old changes over here and you're working on new changes next to it. And you could just go back whenever you want to like grab whatever you want out of that or switch back over. And it's no longer like a specialized feature because JJ does not require you to name your branches. And so because of that, there's not like any confusion about like, okay, I have 3 different heads off the top of this other commit I'm working on. 2 of those are stashes and the third one is the one that I'm working on. And that's like fine. And so it just naturally falls out of sort of JJ's existing primitives rather than needing to be a whole separate feature. And so that's why I think about it as being like simpler, but more powerful at the same time.
Okay. And I think some people might be confused. I think it's very easy to use Git without actually knowing like the underlying, like what are these things?
Sure.
So can you give like a quick explainer of like the difference between like the commits you have, the branch, the index, and the staging area? So
yeah.
Terms that people are probably familiar with, but they might not understand them as concretely.
Right. So when you're working on Git, it expects you to be working like on a branch. And what this means is that the state of the Git repository is pointing at some particular commit, and you've given it a name that identifies what that commit is. And so like the working copy is like described as like, what are all the files on disk that you see? Like when you look at something in your editor, and that's why it's called the working copy, is because it's like the stuff that you modify. And so when you change files around in your working copy, nothing really happens in terms of what Git understands. There's just changes on disk that are separate from the changes that are stored in your repository. And so like a Git repository is always pointed at some particular commit. And well, not necessarily always, but working with like not on a branch is possible in Git, but it is very discouraged. You'll see a very scary message that's like, hey, you're not on a branch right now. And that's kind of like a little not great. So 99.9% of the time you're working on a branch. And so like when you're ready to make a new commit onto that branch, you add the files from your working copy into what Git calls both the index and also the staging area, based on what particular bit of documentation that you're reading. But those two things are the same thing. And that's sort of like this temporary, not quite a commit yet zone that allows you to people say stage your commit. What that means is you're kind of building up what you want to be in the eventual commit once you actually do that. And then once you run the git commit command, that takes your index, your staging area. It takes all of those changes that are in there, not what's in your working copy, but what's in your staging area. And then it makes a new commit out of them. And then it moves the branch ahead to point to that next particular commit. And now you're, working on that new sort of thing there. And so this is kind of, a lot of people use git add -a, and that's for all. And so git add is the command that adds stuff from your working copy to your staging area, and git commit is the thing that takes your staging area and makes it into a commit. And so a lot of people use git commit -a, which just says, please take every change in my working copy and make them all the commit, and sort of skipping the staging area altogether, because a lot of times you don't care about only part of the changes you've made. You want to include it all, but Git kind of gives you the flexibility to be able to only do some of that if you want to. And so the workflow is very much make changes in your local copy and then make commits out of them at the end. And you don't tend to because of the immutable sort of ness of things, you tend to not make changes to existing commits very often, because just the workflow encourages you to sort of stamp out new commits all the time as opposed to modifying existing ones. So yeah, that's my sort of slightly lengthy explanation of the core concepts of Git.
Okay, no, that's I think helpful for a lot of people. Yeah. And so, in comparison to that, where you have your working copy, you're making the changes there, and then you kind of stage them, and then make a commit out of it. What is the kind of workflow in the JJ world? So you said that there's not these concepts, I guess, of the staging area or index does not exist really, and so you just have, I assume, a working copy and then. Yeah, commits.
So everything is kind of almost backwards. So in JJ, you make a new commit and it starts off as empty, and then there's a sort of an alias for the current working copy, which is ampersand or @ So you don't need to refer to a particular change by its name. If it's the one that you're currently checked out or you're looking at, it's @. And so you make a new empty change, and then as you modify your files, you can, by default, it's set up so that when you run a JJ command, it snapshots everything, but you can also set up Watchman so that every time you save a file, it snapshots everything. But when one of those snapshot mechanisms runs, it looks at your working copy and then automatically modifies the current commit to include that information. And so you're kind of instead of making a working copy and then turning into a commit afterwards, in JJ, you make the commit first and then you modify it into what you want. So it feels kind of much more like a mutable thing, even though it is immutable under the hood. The sort of mental workflow aspect is almost exactly the opposite. And so that's kind of the way that the workflow stuff is different, is it's you're sort of automatically snapshotting stuff into a commit that represents the working copy. And the reason why this is cool is not just because it's a little simpler, because there's a lot less stuff missing out, but it's it's way harder to lose stuff in JJ than it is in Git, because until something is in a commit, it's not properly stored in your Git repo. And so if you have changes in your working copy that you haven't committed yet, and you run a command that changes, say you run git checkout, but it's called Git will refer to it as being dirty, where your working copy is dirty or your index doesn't exist. There are Git commands that will blow away those changes that you don't realize are happening until you do it. And so it can be easy to lose work. Even though Git makes it kind of easy to not lose work, it's also if you run the wrong flag to if you put the wrong thing on the -- mixed or -- hard or -- soft, a git reset -- hard will throw away your local working copy changes, because that's what you're asking for. But if you wanted to save something in there, then it's gone, and it wasn't ever in your repo, so sorry, it's just gone. Whereas in JJ, everything is in the repo by default, and so that means that it's much harder to lose these kind of things, because the act of running a JJ command does the snapshot first. And so even commands that would destructively throw away things saves the snapshot of what happened before you ran that destructive command. And so one of the most beloved features of JJ is JJ undo, which is just please undo the last thing that I did. And so it's just so much easier in JJ to I want to see what this command does. I'm just going to run it and see what happens, because I know that if something goes wrong, I can immediately run JJ undo and get back to the state that I was in just now. And so it's like not a big deal to try things out and like, make mistakes, because you'll almost never lose anything.
Right. Yeah, I think it's interesting because this feels like in a lot of ways an evolution of Git by actually like removing stuff, which is rarely what happens. Usually when you need to add layering to something, you have to like add a new concept. But I think it also kind of fits like the way that Git is, I guess, in some ways meant to be used. If you think about like the Linux kernel, where it's like, okay, I make patches and then I email them around, and then you get the patch and then you apply it and make a commit out of it. And like it's meant to be much more, I think, of like a local tool that you have a way of distributing patches or getting patches out of, than it is like a more centralized tool in the way that we've come to use it.
Yeah.
And it feels like JJ is more fitting that work style of like, okay, well, I want something that's like, it's like in Apple, a lot of Apple apps now, where like everything just auto saves. Mm-hmm. Like with Final Cut Pro, when I'm editing something, like I never have to hit like Command S, because there's no I have to save, because everything is just always continuously being saved. So if I make a mistake, I can just go back, or if it crashes, I don't like lose everything. Like I've had back in the old days, lost so many big projects and stuff just because like my editor crashed and I hadn't saved it long enough. So that aspect was really nice, and I feel like that's like a more modern feature that I think like probably people that work on the Linux kernel are like, well, you should just like manage Git better or something like that. But I think like for a lot of people, this is a much smoother workflow for them, because it's like, okay, well, like everything is being added over time, which I think is like the mental concept that people have anyway. But doesn't really fit with, I think, how a lot of maybe the kernel developers want to work, where they want to be extremely intentional about like what they're adding, what gets into the patch. Like they're most likely not doing a lot of git add -a or -a to add everything all at once. They probably want to be a little bit more careful about adding what they're adding to their index, because you want to make sure that you're intentionally adding things into something like the Linux kernel. But I think for a lot of us, we're just like, a lot of people just learn to use I like do all my changes in the working copy, and then I just add everything, and then I just commit it, and like that's just the flow. And if that's just your flow, then the JJ flow definitely, at least to me, seems to make more sense as like you should just work in this way then, because that careful adding of things is not a step that you're really care about all of that much.
Like for a lot of people, it's just like the index is not a thing that matters to them, and so it's fine. And so JJ does support that like really well, and this is why some people, like I have a friend who is not a developer, but he's like technical enough to need to use Git for some things sometimes, and he just uses JJ now because he's like, this is just easier for me to understand how it works.
All right, so we've gone over like what is JJ and kind of the underlying things, how it's different from Git. How do people get started with this thing? Like, how would you recommend someone that's like, I'm convinced I want to use JJ? What's the first thing that they should do?
So jj-vcs.dev is the website for JJ, and you can find all the documentation there. One of the things that's kind of been in progress for a long time and that I need to finally freaking finish is I did not like there's another way that's like similar to Rust, is that I did not like the official tutorial very much, and I found it confusing. And so I wrote my own version. So there's also linked from that website is like a link to my tutorial as well, which obviously I'm biased because I like it because it's mine, but I never ended up actually finishing it because I got busy with some other stuff. And so it gets you going, but it's not like literally everything yet. And so one of the things I've been meaning to finish off for the last like year and a half is to like migrate that into the official documentation, but it's linked from the official docs as well, and so you can find it pretty easily, or Steve's Jujutsu tutorial on Google, and that'll get you set up. But really it's just like downloading and installing it, and then JJ Git init will take a Git repository and add the little JJ repository stuff next to it, and then you're kind of like off to the races. So
okay. Can you maybe walk through what a typical development workflow might look like for someone, or like maybe the one that you would recommend people use?
Yeah, so there's kind of like two workflows that are very popular, and they're kind of based off of like, do you get commit -a or not? And so the first one is called like the edit workflow. And basically what that means is because it's based off of the JJ edit. So JJ edit takes a commit and it like makes it the working copy. And so then, as we discussed, every time you modify something, it gets put in the working copy. And so in this kind of world, you like make all your changes. And then when you're ready to go, there's a command called git JJ commit. And what that does is it adds the commit message to the current commit you're working on and then makes a new one on top of it. And so then you just modify the stuff you're doing and then you go like that. And so that's the sort of thing. What a lot of people move to after that, or if they're doing something a little more complicated, is sort of the what if you're building up a commit from changes with git add sort of workflow. And that's called the squash workflow. And because it's what I described earlier, where you sort of start by using JJ new to make a new commit, and then you make your changes on that, and then you use JJ squash to put the parts of the change that you want back into the parent, and then you end up describing, what you want in the parent, and once that's ready and built up, then you make a new change on top of it, and now your existing parent is the one you're working on. And so those are kind of the two sort of major ones based on that. But because JJ is so flexible, it kind of invents sort of any workflow that you want. So for people who do have 5 outstanding branches all the time, there's a more complicated workflow called the mega merge workflow, where it allows you to sort of work on a merge commit of all your outstanding branches at once. And so this can be really nice if you're, especially if you have changes that you want to sort of like build on top of each other or rely on each other for things like you can kind of like make changes in your current commit and then send them back to whichever particular branch you happen to want to save those changes onto. And so that's something that is useful for open source people that are doing a lot of stuff simultaneously, but I tend to not use it too much myself. But those are kind of the sort of three main ways that people work, although the first two are much more popular than the third. The third is just kind of cooler, and so people always end up talking about it regardless.
Yeah, no, it does seem like when you break down that concept and now you just have like commits you're working on, it seems like the types of workflows that you can have just really explode, right? You're going from like having one working copy and like one index to being like, oh, I can have like as many of these things as I really want to suit the workflow that I'm trying to do, and everything just works together more or less, which is really cool. I like that.
I will also say that JJ does, even though things feel very mutable, it has sort of this concept of immutable versus mutable commits. And so by default, like state that's shared elsewhere is immutable. And so it'll say like, hey, this is an immutable commit you're trying to modify. So if you want to do that, you can pass a flag, but like, just so you know. So it does make it easy to not like accidentally change a commit that's already landed on main or trunk or master and then accidentally rebase all your stuff and then whatever, like it will try to like also be like, hey, this is the stuff you can change and this is stuff you shouldn't probably change. And so like that also is like a nice little foot guard against accidentally modifying shared history if that's not what you're trying to do. And if you're trying to do it, then it'll let you. But
yeah, that's some of the tools in the plumbing layer of Git will just allow you like, oh yeah, you just want to rewrite all of the history, go for it, sure. Which is they definitely give you some warnings sometimes, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're just like, oh, like Git reset is always one of the ones that's just like, be careful running this and what you're doing, because you might obliterate some things that you didn't mean to obliterate. And then actually going and finding those things, as long as you have a garbage collected, is usually possible, but still very, very, very messy. The Git ref log is a hostile place for most people.
Yeah.
Even though I have many a time I've spent a lot of time in there in my past when I'm just like, oh crap, I just blew away something I did not mean to blow away. Let me go back. And I guess in that way, Git does have its own version of undo. It's just
totally. It's user hostile, and it also only keeps track of where refs have previously pointed. And so if you're like, if you blew away your working copy, for example, that's not going to be in the ref log because it was never a ref in the first place. Whereas JJ undo is keeping track of like literally everything that's ever changed. And so it can, it's got more, JJ's kind of built on, it's like operation log, which is like very similar to a write ahead log if you've been database stuff. And so undo is just actually a special casing command of like, look up the most recent op in the op log and then reset stuff back to there. And then keeping track of like which ones. It used to be the case that if you undid twice, the second undo would undo the first undo and take you back to the original thing, which is very surprising to a lot of people. It's like the most straightforward version of this, but it was like also like a little like whatever. And nowadays it'll properly understand like, okay, this is an undo stack and it'll go back multiple undos. But you can also like pick an arbitrary arbitrary one if you want with the oplog and go back to it, sort of like the ref log. It's just there's more in the oplog than there is on the ref log because of the way that stuff works. So
okay,
yeah,
that is definitely useful because the ref log not having all of the things in it was always one of like the downsides of it, where if you blew away something you're working copy, accidentally deleted a file, sorry. I think it's also interesting because I feel like perhaps in the past people would have been like, this workflow seems like it might have problems with like disk space usage, and I think in the modern day we do not care about disk space usage when it comes to like the kind of stuff you put in Git repos. So I think that has evolved. Like back in 2005, right, like hard disks were very small. They were in some cases like 100 times smaller, right? You might have 10 gigs, you might have 40 gigs. Like you didn't have a terabyte of space, right? You didn't even have like 500 gigs of space, right?
Yeah.
So being very careful with what you were putting into things was a bit more important back then.
Yeah. And it's also, just to be clear too, all these intermediate commits aren't like shared. Like when you do the JJ push, like it sends the latest version of all of those commits up, but it doesn't like it doesn't send all of the intermediate ones as well. And so your actual like on disk, like you're not sharing these things with other people you're working on by default, and it's not going to blow up your remote repo in size because you're not saving all these things permanently. And if you end up having too much locally, there's ways of saying like, okay, for ancient history, please clear out all of those like details that I don't care about at this point. And so so it like a JJ repo will be slightly larger than a Git repo on your local disk because of the fact that you're doing these commands, but you can always just like Git will GC old refs after a long time if you have things that you didn't end up putting anywhere. Like JJ can clean up all the old stuff if you want to like not keep track of some of the variations of things that have happened a long time ago. So that helps.
Although
too.
Git will clean up old objects, not refs.
Yeah.
Because refs are the
right.
things
It does not clean up. Yes. Yeah. That's okay. Yes. Thank you for that correction because you were totally right. It's very important. It does not clean up refs, and that's why you can't be not on a branch. Is because if you're not on a branch, it doesn't have a ref, and so it's not saved permanently.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. For anybody that might be confused by that, like Git has, there's objects for everything. There's objects for commits and for files and all of that. And then refs are the pointers we were talking about earlier, right? So a branch is just a ref. A tag is just a ref. And all that is like a file that just has an object hash in it. And it's like, this is the thing that I point at, which is also how like Gerrit actually builds up its concepts of things, because it just has other refs in there that are like, this ref is a review, right? And it's like, oh, this is not like a commit, it's a different type of Git object, but it has to have those refs, because if it doesn't have those refs, like the Git GC system will just blow them away, because it's like, this is not pointed at by anything, so I can collect it in the same way that like GCs in programming, most programming languages work, where it's like it looks at all of the stuff that's in the heap and it's like, nothing points at this, so I can get rid of this thing.
Yeah.
So it's GC in the same sense as it is in like a language like Go or JavaScript or Java or whatever. All right. So I think we've talked enough about JJ and like how to get started with it and the concept behind it. You are working at East River Source Control, and y'all are building a hub for JJ that kind of more natively speaks the JJ protocol. And there was an announcement that like, I guess like y'all are moving forward, like you're ready for some, I guess, early customers, or you want early customers.
Yeah. So we're building a forge, and we're calling it ChangeSet, because like East River Source Control and Ersk is like is bad branding for most things, but like GitHub is incorporated as Logical Awesome, and basically nobody knows that because they know about GitHub, which is the product name, not the company name. And so we're kind of going with ChangeSet as the name for our like forge. And yeah, we put out an announcement earlier. My friend Florian messaged me with good. He's like, when you guys do your public release announcement, please make it an update to Ersk's availability, because GitHub's big outage last week was titled like an update to GitHub's availability, and that's because we're becoming available for the first time. So I do love GitHub. I spend most of my life on there. I don't want to make this all about like GitHub kind of thing, but we just wanted to lightly tease about that kind of thing, because like we're focusing on building a forge that is able to, as we sort of talked about earlier with a scale down kind of thing, we're sort of building the Mono-Repo tooling that exists inside of things like Meta and Google, and making that as a product that you can actually sort of buy. And so we're trying to focus more on companies that are, having big repo scaling problems. Then I have a little open source project that I'm hosting on GitHub. So if you are having version control pain right now, we'd love to talk to you, but the sort of like stage that we're at is still pretty early, but we have enough of a product together that like, depending on what people's needs are, it turns out that like a Git server that does not fall over is like a product category now. I would say that like wasn't a product category earlier, but so we are building on top of JJ, but our server is kind of interesting because it is fundamentally not a Git server in sort of a very JJ way. It's not a Git. We're not storing a Git repo on disk. We are storing our own thing, but the server happens to speak Git's protocol at ingress and egress. So you don't even need to use JJ right now to use our forge, technically speaking. You can just use Git because it talks via the Git protocol, but we have better scaling probabilities than if we were storing a regular native Git repo itself. And so that is like a nice sort of like onboarding. And then as stuff grows, we do eventually expect that customers will hit that sort of those inherent scaling properties of the Git protocol itself too. And so we'll have a JJ native way of talking to the forge as well, but that's something that's coming later and is something we want to make sure to work on with upstream, so that's not like a proprietary version of our thing, but it's something that anybody who is using a JJ native repo kind of thing, because like right now that doesn't really exist. There's sort of really only there's like the testing backend that's used in the unit tests. There's the Git backend that's open source, and there's the Piper backend that's closed source. So there hasn't really been a JJ native transport protocol because everybody just uses the Git one in the open source world. And so we want to work with upstream to make sure that that's not like hyper proprietary to us, but again, with that sort of idea of the big thing scaling down, we have this like onboarding path through just Git or, through JJ via the Git protocol at first. And then eventually we'll have something where when that's a problem for you. But like we're trying to make sure that our repo can handle like commits per second is the metric we're talking about in terms of volume, not like, this many commits per day or this many commits per hour. It's like you should be able to land 1,000 commits per second, and that should be able to handle that. And that's just like something that's not necessarily like possible with sort of the way that things are going on today. So anyway, it's just small pitch, but that's also why I care about this. I think it's important for disclosure purposes that like, while I have been using JJ for a long time before it professionally mattered to me, it is also a thing that, I do have some professional interest in. So it's good to mention as well.
Yeah. I guess we like brushed over the topic, but we didn't really get into it a bit. But like, what are some of the scaling problems that Git has for like make it so like having at these
this isn't the thing that I work on personally, so I'll give you a very high level answer that I need to like actually dig more into those specifics so I can answer this question better. But basically, like, my understanding is a lot of stuff about the pack file format that you basically need to sort of download the whole pack file before you can read into parts of it. Like, it's not really built for incremental stuff very well. And just basically like some of the stuff like that is sort of like these legacy decisions that were made at the time that weren't really made with like, well, how does this scale infinitely kind of situation? And so people have lots of problems with like pack file generation, then also just, like modifying, like there's sort of, again, I guess I'm going to give a slightly evasive answer because I need to brush up on the technical stuff a little bit more. But like, we can do like to update a ref. There's sort of like work that needs to be done in the sort of native Git sense to update some things. But because we're sort of building like I put it this way, as you mentioned earlier, Git is kind of a content digestible file system. And so it's really file system shaped. And that's kind of like the way that it works. But you can also view it as a database. And so like the fact that it's kind of like a file system on your file system, like, means that the commands modify your file system to do things. And file systems are also databases, but they're also not really exactly databases. And so because our thing is like an actual honest to God database, we can do things a little bit more transactionally faster because we don't need to touch the file system. Like, we can make changes in memory to modify things and then write them out to disk later, like a real database does. As opposed to with Git, you have to use the file system to update stuff. And so if you're storing a native Git repo, you kind of need the file system to finish its work before you can say the repo is in a new clean state. Whereas because our stuff is actually running in memory because we're an actual server process that's running all the time, as opposed to where Git doesn't really have like a daemon running, those trade-offs end up working differently. And so we can end up having a lot more higher volume stuff because we are in memory in a lot of places where, because Git, I think rightfully, like it was a good design decision for Git to not require a daemon. Like I do think that is like a good architectural choice for them, but it does mean that you end up running into limits where, like, because you have to wait on the file system, it's just slower than operating purely in memory, and that's like an advantage of that kind of stuff. So that's, I think, like a slightly hand wavy, but maybe a little more understandable version of like what you run into with these kinds of like problems, essentially. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, numbers of commits per second is definitely like okay, you're at a certain scale. You have a certain number of like engineers or other systems writing code that like that's a scaling problem for sure.
Yeah. And like also being incredibly fair to GitHub, like this started as the good transition into the AI stuff. Like the part of the reason why we started the company was before GitHub started falling apart, and like, so we didn't like do this in response to GitHub having all these scaling problems, but we did sort of believe that while we're not really an AI based product, like there's no AI in the product, we kind of believe that AI is making developers work differently. And some of the implications of that are you're going to want to reach for a monorepo sooner because you want Claude to have the full context of what you're doing. And that's much easier when it's all, when you're able to have that on disk next to each other and can just go look at the other code. That matters. So that naturally pushes people towards monorepos. And then also that pushes people towards committing more often because they're, using 5 agents simultaneously means you're doing a lot more commit traffic than you are, when you're working just by yourself. And also monorepos also do, because it's one repo, you just naturally have faster commits because everybody's committing to the same repo. And so those kinds of properties we believed are going to lead to these scaling problems. And so that's kind of like why we sort of think that people are going to have larger company shaped problems earlier in the company's life than they have been historically. And so that's what, when GitHub talks about why their outages happen, like it's not because they're incompetent or because they're bad. It's because their traffic went up like 45x in 1 year. Yeah. And that's just like hard to manage. And so, that's kind of like, one of the things. And so like one of the GitHub's problems is that it was built as a SaaS first. And so it's, one customer's downtime ends up affecting basically every other customer unless you're on enterprise. And a lot of people that, don't want to do their own stuff or whatever else, or like, there's a lot of people who are using the sort of SaaS version of GitHub. And also like some of his enterprise stuff is not as fully sorted out, blah, 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 blah. And so like we've developed stuff in a way where it's bring your own cloud. And so you're running your own copy of our stuff yourself. And so if we had scaling problems, which we're first of all just trying to architect it so that we don't, but like if one customer breaks things, it doesn't break everything for every customer because each customer has their own deployment of things. And so, that's just like a more natural way of scaling up, is that like, you don't have a 1% downtime for one customer means 100% downtime for all customers when you're doing sort of the default SaaS kind of like platform sort of sense of the world. And so we want to make it sure that like customers like if customers have a downtime, it does not affect other customers and stuff like that like kind of matters, that we're doing stuff that's more big company focused than the sort of like social network that GitHub is doing.
Yeah, that's it's fair. I think it would be fair to say that probably GitHub is experiencing some of the AI side of things where it's like, everybody is writing more code with AI and can have more bugs, so you're probably going to have more outages. But I think the bulk of where GitHub is having its availability problems, if you look at the graphs of like number of repos created, number of commits they're getting, it's just like really up and to the right. It's crazy how much more traffic they're handling. And any company really would, I think, struggle to have that big of an increase that quickly unless you're already at like an absurd scale, which they're at a big scale, but not nearly as absurd of scale as they are now.
Yeah. And that's like, it also goes back to our small versus big thing too, right? It's like, if you made choices that made sense for your current state of scale and you're like, well, I might need to make different choices if it was bigger. And now you're getting 50 times the traffic you were previously not overnight, but like pretty quickly, then you're kind of in trouble, and that takes a lot of work to adjust it. And so I definitely like, while people are sick of GitHub going down, Like, and that is true that that's painful. I do also want to recognize that I don't believe that's due to, like, people reach for, as you said, oh, they must be using a lot of AI to write their code and it must be crappy code and that's why it's going down. No, I don't think that's the case. I think that they're stumbling under the weight of tremendous success, and that's like actually kind of like, you know, a problem for users, but it's also like, it's not because they're incompetent. It's because just like AI is changing a lot of this stuff and it's causing them to have, you know, just way more traffic than they were doing previously. So like that's just hard. It's not simple.
Yeah. And if you combine that too with the fact that like they're probably getting attacked way more than they did in the past with all of the different, you know, it's so much easier to do things like that. So you're dealing with like so many different issues, which is why like a lot of companies are facing like a lot of outages right now. It's both, and a lot of cases it's a mix, right? It's a mix of, yeah, you're writing more code with AI, so you're probably going to have more bugs, even if you're a very competent person. Just like there's only so much code you can review, and like we've been using tools to like make it so we can write code faster. But there's also just like the entire ecosystem has shifted now, where like the things that people can do, everybody can do everything faster, which means that we hit a giant scale over a very quick period of time. Which I do think leads into like the other conversation I think we should have is around just like AI in general at the moment, because we're in this really weird spot with it, right? It kind of feels like that spot where I know it's different, but with like Uber, or I guess in some ways AWS, where it's like, oh, like the prices are no longer just going down, or like kind of we're starting to see how subsidized some of the stuff actually is.
The Opus 4.7 question is kind of interesting. I have not really had that much of a beef with 4.7. I know that your opinions are not your own. Like many people have said that they think of 4.7 as being a regression. And I think it's also really interesting to sort of look at how 4.7 is like different than 4.6 in not just like, it's more different than the 4.5 to 4.6 difference was, because 4.6 was kind of just like a better 4.5, but 4.7 is sort of like changed their tokenizer and a couple other things that make, I've seen some speculation that 4.7 is like 4.6 plus some distillation out of Mythos. And so that's kind of like also sort of an interesting kind of like question. But yeah, it's definitely, I think there's kind of like two things here. The first is like a question of, are these models getting better in an objective way? And are these models getting better in a subjective way? And I think what's interesting is the objective is really, really difficult to actually do, because like, yeah, we have benchmarks, but like the question is always like, do those benchmarks actually reflect reality or not? And so like the numbers keep going up on the benchmarks, but like, is that real, or is that like overfitting on the benchmarks? I think that the reason why a lot of it's like kind of both to some degree, because I think that the frontier labs have their own benchmarks. They don't care as much about the public ones. Like they would care if there was a severe regression, but I don't really think that they like overtrain on the public benchmarks. But I think some of the open models, or some of those, like the reason why they're actually a year behind the frontier models, but they post the same numbers on the benchmarks, is because I think they're like overtraining on the benchmarks a little too much. And so they like end up, so that's like one of the interesting things, is that you sort of want to be objective about it, but also subjectively, it doesn't really matter if it says it's 10% better on the benchmark, if when you're using it, it feels bad. And so I think one of the reasons why I haven't noticed, why I have been a little more up on 4.7 than some other people, is because I tend to like tell Claude what I want to do, and then it churns for an hour, and then I look at the outcome on the other end. And so I'm doing a lot less like iterative, interactive development with it all the time. And so it making more mistakes in the moment is like, if it's taking an hour and 15 versus an hour and 4.6, like I don't notice or feel that difference, because I'm much more like kick off this thing and then see what happens at the end. And so the day-to-day subjective thing is like not as something that I'm as tuned into as I was in other times in my career. And so I think that's like an interesting part about how we feel about using these tools, is also such an overbearing like thing that's kind of like interesting. I mean, programmers have always been very like caring about the feeling of their tools, but I think it matters a lot more now.
I would say like the big thing with 4.7 for me, like I'm actually at the point now where I like have written a custom style, because it was getting so ridiculous, where if you are using it more in chat mode where you're like interacting with it, like every answer had so many more tokens than it needed to have in its output. and it was also pattern matched to like the AI LLM language that it was just getting exhausting to use it, right?
Sure.
I'd like ask it one thing and then it'd go make a bunch of assumptions and then run off another direction. And that's why I had to make a style, because I'm like, you need to stop doing this. And like I switched back to 4.7 and Sonnet, and it's like, especially with the custom style I wrote, it's like much more concise about things. But like with 4.7, it was just getting so fatiguing interacting with it, because I'm not like just, if I was just kicking it off and asking it to do something, it would do fine things, right? Like when I have it make the chapters for this podcast, right? I just go and it spends 20 minutes going through all the audio and or the transcripts and figuring out what the chapters should be, and it spits out chapters at the end, and I'm like, these are good enough, right? But for anything where I'm like actually interacting with it, that's where the noticeable decrease in quality comes from. Because it is. And it's just taking longer to do things because it's doing so much more thinking, right? And if you don't have the thinking up high, then it does make a lot more mistakes on things. So it's like, or it like can't find things. Like I got a Intel Arc B70 or Intel Arc Pro B70 graphics card. So I was like, this is relatively inexpensive and it's 32 gigs of RAM. Let me like try this thing out. And I was sitting there like getting everything set up, and I was working with Claude. I was like, hey, what's this? And it like led me down this entire debugging trail. And I was just like, let me Google this. Because it was like, you need to RMA this card because there's this problem with this thing internally and these speeds. And I went and Googled it, and I'm like, oh no, this is just a known thing that like it doesn't present the PCIe internal switch properly to the outside world, and there's something wrong with the card. But it like ate 2 hours of my time because it like went on this tangent, because I was like, okay, well, I'm having some problems and maybe you'll be able to tell me the right thing. But it's like, it's becoming more of one of those tools where you like have to really know what you're doing or have to be able to know how to steer it, where before I don't think it was behaving in that way as much. So that's like a noticeable change I've also seen. Is it's like,
they did say that they like 4.7 was like trained to be a little more autonomous, because like one of the things that people care about as a metric is like, how big of a task can I let it go on? Like, and it was like a year ago, it used to be like it could do 10 minutes on its own, and then that's about it, where it needs like human intervention. And now it's like approaching multi-hour. Like I have personally, I think my record is like 2.5 hours of it just like kind of going off and doing its own thing. But like it definitely is able to do things more for longer, and that kind of means giving it more, it needs to have more autonomy, because like the reason why it wasn't able to do that before is because it needed to check in more often, because it wasn't like personality wise, it wasn't bold enough to assume what it needed to do. And so now with 4.7, I definitely have seen some people, and you included, as you're just saying, being like, well, it decides a thing and then it follows that path, and that's not always the right thing. And then that ends up meaning it wastes a bunch of time because it like is like a little too autonomous for the amount of correctness it has. And so there's kind of that like weird push and pull balance, right? Of like, if it's not going to be correct, you kind of want it to be less autonomous, but if it's more correct, you want it to be more autonomous. Right. And the mismatch happens when those things are like, off of each other, basically.
Yeah, I also think it's like the mode of operation, where it's like you don't want it to make assumptions when you're interactively working with it, because it's very easy, especially with how confident it almost always is. It's very easy for you to be like, okay, you seem like you know more about this, and you have access to all this information. Like I would have expected. In some ways, I think this too, maybe not using web search enough, I would have expected at some point for you to like do a web search and be like, hey, maybe this, instead of being I see this, so this must be reality. So I think there's like, on that level, it's not as good, but it tries to present itself as good, which makes it wind up feeling worse. Whereas I think previous models would have been like, I'm not sure, let's maybe do a web search, or maybe you should look for something. So I think there definitely needs to be some sort of bifurcation here on like how we wind up using these tools, because if you're just having it autonomously churn, if it goes and spends 5 minutes on some tangent and I'm not involved, I don't care, right? Or if it spends an hour on a tangent and I'm not involved and do something else, I don't really care, right? As long as I'm not paying that token per pill million token bill, I don't care. But like, if I'm interacting with it and I was wasted my time, I very much do care. Or if it went and just spent $50 on some tangent, like, yes, I very much will care. Which I think is also a place where it's like, a lot of the way these models are getting better is by like basically burning more tokens or shoving more tokens in the output, so it has more like context to work with. But that also is more tokens that you're outputting, and like output tokens are by far the most expensive thing of this thing. So if you're shoving more tokens out, that is costing more money, which again, if you're on a max 20x subscription, you don't really care because it's not your money that you're paying. But as there's more of a need to work with the API side of things, I think that is an important aspect of this, of like, this stuff will start costing us more money. And I think it'll be a lot like Uber, where I think it'll be tolerable for a while, but then we're going to hit a point where people are like, okay, I can't use this thing because it's going to cost me $150 to make this one PR. That does not seem worth it.
Well, this is why Mythos is not like being pushed out as their new model everyone uses, right? Like when Opus happened, it's like gone back and forth between whether Sonnet or Opus were the default, but Opus has been the default for like a while because it's just like better and like not, and so that's like, there was a little bit of time where they went back to Sonnet by default, but like Opus is the default for a long time. And Mythos is not even available publicly, partially because it is so expensive. And I have like heard rumors about it being like those runs that you hear about where it's like it found a zillion bugs in this project or whatever. It's like can cost like $500,000 a run to like run or whatever. Right. And so, that's like cool and all, but it is also like not a thing that you're doing unless you're a big serious organization. And so I think that like we've been in a mode where you always use the absolute latest frontier model because it has been getting solidly better, as you mentioned. And I think while still in general, overall, they still are getting better, I think that because of these sort of subjective is maybe not quite fair, but let's put it like the requirements are changing. If you evaluated 4.7 based on the like way you evaluated LLMs a year ago, which is like, can it do this 10-minute task well and effectively, I think that it would do better. Like it has gotten better on that objective metric, but both subjectively and objectively, because we now are using them in a different way and because we have higher expectations, it like does feel like it is not clearly better because of some of the ways in which our expectations have changed in the last year, especially, and with these kind of things. And so I do think like, and this again kind of gets back to the sort of like also the question about open models versus frontier models. Like there's sort of like a threshold of goodness, and we cared a lot about the frontier models because the frontier models were over that threshold of goodness and the not frontier models were not. But once everybody is past, like specifically November, December of last year was the time where a lot of people said like, okay, these are finally like good enough that I'm willing to use them where I weren't before. And so a year from now, when the open models that are a year behind the cutting edge are also over that threshold, like I think that you'll see a lot more people be more interested in using open models because they're finally like good enough and you don't need to pay somebody else to use them other than, jacking up your electricity bill. And also like, I think that the more people will be more open to using older model families because those are also like, I know that I like 4.6 and it's worked well for me and I'm going to continue using 4.6. Even if a 4.8 comes out or a 5.0 comes out, maybe it will also have these subjective qualities that are not as useful to your particular use case. And so you'll stick on 4.6 for as long as it's available because like, that's like a model that works a little better. And I think we'll see more sort of like model choice, I guess. Like historically speaking, it's kind of been like, use whatever the default best model is and whatever that is fine. But I think we're getting in a situation where it's a little more of like, I think we'll have more like manager Opus with workhorse Sonnet kind of workflows, where it's like you do different models in what they're good at and bad at, because like if Opus is a little too willing to like go off on tangents, maybe it making big decisions and have Sonnet making small decisions where Sonnet does not go off on the tangents because it's much more of like, I just implement this thing and don't care about the big picture. Like that might work better. And I think we're just going to kind of like see how this sort of works out. And also like, we've been talking almost exclusively about Anthropic's models because we both tend to use them, but like I've been meaning to check out Codex a little more and like play around with OpenAI stuff a little more because, if Anthropic starts messing up, then like, okay, I'll go use a different one for a while and see, how that's better. And I've heard that 5.5 for OpenAI is like real good, and like, but I don't know, but maybe these beefs with Claude would not be a thing if I was using Codex. And so you got to kind of like, also I think competition is good. Like while I am more sympathetic to Anthropic than I am OpenAI on many other levels, like I do think that competition is good and monopoly is bad. And so I do think that when Claude starts making mistakes, being able to switch to codecs is like important.
Yeah.
And so I don't want that to like totally die either. So, but I should put my money where my mouth is a little more and like actually use it. Cause like I have not actually spent any time with codecs because I've been so busy with various things.
Right.
But like that's definitely like on the to-do list because of the fact that it's easy enough to switch out. Yeah.
Yeah. I have seen Claude Code use, like when I do the stuff with the podcast, right? It will use Haiku for a lot of stuff, a lot of tasks, like I think it's mostly doing like summarization of like, what is this section about or whatever, and trying to figure out the section of it. So it's like a little bit of Opus usage and then like a ton of Haiku usage, which is like Haiku is like so cheap that it's like, it winds up being like $4 for something that would have been more expensive if I used exclusively Opus. Yeah. So that's nice. But yeah, it's also like, I've realized, I kind of wrote a thing about this yesterday when I was just sitting with it of like, we have, and this is a typical thing that happens in the industry of like a solution is proposed to us, right? Like, here is the chat interface. This is the thing you should use. Or here's like a subscription. This is the thing you should use. And I think we're transitioning a lot of these LLMs and, the whole family of them, ALMs, VLMs, all of that, into like actually being tools and us having to use them like tools. Like, no longer is it just you use the newest model because that one's the best. No longer is it like you just use your subscription because that's like the best option for you. It's like, okay, now we actually have to think about like, well, yeah, I like using my subscription, but if Claude goes down, I still want to be able to work. So like the ability to switch to just Codex or one of the GPT models is important, or even just like being able to use Google's models if you want to do like audio stuff, which Claude does not do natively, or even like some of the other ones like Kimi.
I guess I always forget about Gemini, but earlier when I did my little like, there's the two big ones and then the other two don't matter. I think Google is very much in the halfway thing of where it's like weird that they're definitely better than Olama or Grok, but they're like also not. They don't have the same mind share that Codex and Claude do. Yeah,
it's weird because I've in the few interactions I've used with Gemini, it's been very good. Like, I want to start using it for transcription stuff because WhisperX is great, but it has some stumbling blocks that I don't like. But like trying to use, it's like a typical Google product. We're trying to figure out how to actually use Gemini is obnoxiously difficult. Trying to figure out how their subscription works is obnoxiously difficult. And I'm just like AI Studio is nice, but even just trying to figure out how to like select the right model for me to use in AI Studio was like, oh, I have to click this thing and then it'll show and like, this is annoying. They do have some really cool things. Like they have like in OpenAI or Anthropic, they both have like batch APIs you can use if you want to wait. Gemini has this Flex API, which is like a halfway point. It costs the same amount as batch, but it's synchronous. And it's just like, oh, we'll run it between like 1 and 15 minutes, which I think is a very interesting use case for these agentic. It just churns. So they're going to throw out. It's like, well, if you're willing to wait 2 hours, well, what if you have to just wait 3 hours and it costs half as much now? Like, that's a very like appealing thing if you're paying per API. So like, and obviously Google has, the Gemma models, which are very good. And like, they're really pushing toward hey, you can actually like someone built like an actual, like on your phone, like on an iPhone running like one of the smaller Gemma models. And it seemed pretty good from what they were doing. So it's like, they're kind of like, they are really splitting the difference here where they have like their big frontier stuff and they also have their like open frontier stuff. But definitely for me personally, because the things I'm trying to build are not necessarily things that like, I need I need like good reasoning, but I don't need like the frontier level reasoning because it's like I want to do. I think I've talked about it on the podcast before. I'm not sure if I've talked about it with you on the podcast, but I'm trying to build this like rhetorical analysis system to like put writing that I want to read through so that I can see, is this thing filled with like rhetorical, what I call like rhetorical machinery or devices that like launder the argument, where it's like you're either making your argument stronger or weaker than it actually is. And I would like to know this before I actually read your thing, because reading your thing might try and trick me into believing something that like it didn't actually say, which is something that happens a lot with writing. And this is something that LLMs are obviously going to be very good at if you structure them very carefully, because they have the capability of like reading the same thing over and over and not remembering past runs and all of that if you clear the context. But this will require me like running a lot of different cycles of an LLM, and I have it like working right now with Claude, right? I use Claude Code, but it has like, it runs like 54 parallel agents to like process through it, and then runs another like 18 after it, because there's like 18 metrics and there's 3 different ways I run it. So it's like it winds up running 74 different subagents to like do one analysis. And that's part I have to re-architect. But it's like that's gonna cost a lot of money if I have to run that, not in a subscription. And so I'm looking at all these local stuff and all these local models, and it's like, okay, well, actually these like 27 billion, 35 billion parameter models are actually like pretty capable these days of doing very, like, if you give it a specific task and they're like, hey, evaluate this thing on this metric, it tends to work pretty well. Nice. And it's like, that's not free, but it's much cheaper than doing a lot of API based stuff. But it also has like availability is like, as long as my server's on, it's working, which is nice. But like having to mix all these things together is now like, okay, now I actually have to build my own tooling and my own infrastructure around this. And it's also helping me because I'm doing it at like the lowest layer. Like I'm using Llama CPP and Zig to build this all out.
Nice.
And it's like, oh, you really start to understand, like, how are these things working under the hood? Why is so much of the way the industry works, like, doing it that way? It's like, oh, okay, there's these really low-level concerns most people don't know about. But that's why I say it's like feeling more like a tool or a set of tools compared to a solution. Because once you get into that nitty-gritty, like, a whole world of other options open, including just, like, not using the chat interface. And actually being able to be like, this is just part of my program. Like, part of my program invokes an LLM and does some inference, and then takes that output and then does something with it. And maybe it'll invoke an LLM again and do some more inference, or maybe it'll go do a web search and get the results, or a whole bunch of different things it might do. But it's no longer, like, in my mind, I no longer see it as like, there's the LLM and I want the LLM to do all of the things. It is like, it's like the inversion of going from like an IDE to using like Vim plus terminal, where it's like, okay, before my IDE is where I lived and I did everything in there, and now it's like the editor part is just like a part of a larger system of other things that I can piece together how I want.
Nice. Yeah.
So that's been a good experience, but it does like really just change your perspective, I think, on a lot of this stuff of like, okay, like, what models can I use? When should I use what models? What's the best way to get to the best result? Which I think is different than it was 6 months ago, where it was just like, pick a frontier lab, pick their best model, and go use that thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So what other AI topics should we talk about?
There's one tiny little bit of news from the last couple of days, which is Bun. Gerrit, the guy who started Bun, published a branch where he is using Claude to port Bun from Zig to Rust. And
it's not technically AI related news, but the big like Apple announcement of, right, like, I mean, anybody that has paid attention to the Apple news knew that, or Apple like world knew that John Ternus was going to be the new CEO of Apple at some point. I think some of us were like, it seems like it's going to happen soon. Like Snazzy Labs made a very good video about this a few months ago, where he's just like, well, all of the people that were part of Tim Cook's like C-suite, they are all leaving. So it seems like this is what you do when you set up a transition, because you don't want the people who have been there forever to stick around, because those people are either consciously or subconsciously like kind of tied to the CEO that they had before. And so those people start retiring or they otherwise leave. And then you have a whole new slate of people that comes in and works. And it was very clear they were setting up John Ternus to be like the new CEO. But I think it's super interesting because I feel like putting the hardware and design guy, I think people don't know that he also has, for I think a couple of years now, had the design group that was Johnny Ive's group. So people are like, why the hardware guy? And like, he's not just a hardware guy, he's a hardware and design guy, right? Like he's basically like, if you put Johnny Ive as CEO, in like a kind of hand wavy way, because Johnny Ive did not do hardware engineering, he just did design. But it's like, it's not as surprising as I think people are sometimes making out to be. But I think the important thing about that is I think that we'll see more of this trend of like Apple being the hardware focused company and Apple building out more machines that are going to be capable of running local models, right? They're obviously very heavily invested in this, not in any of the building or developing of models, right? They're like, Google, you go do this for us. Like they're going to put, I think they
recently accidentally pushed a Claude MD out in some software they distributed, and they had to do an emergency security update to remove the lot of D files. So
it's like I think that Gemini is going to be powering Siri in like the next release or whatever. So they're just like, we're not gonna get into this model fight because it seems like the commodity that can be easily swapped out for something else. But I do think they're going to focus on making their hardware like the best at running LLMs most efficiently, so you can like run them in the background. So I wouldn't be surprised to see like in a year or two people actually buying Mac Minis, not just to run OpenClaw, which like obviously does not use a local model, but buying it so that you can like maybe like 128 gig Mac Mini so that you can run the frontier big open source models or open weight models locally with a decent token per second, so that now you do have something that can actually compete with the frontier models, and it runs locally and it does not even consume that much electricity because like Apple Silicon is that good that it consumes almost no electricity.
Yeah, it's awesome for sure. And I think that Tim Apple did a totally good job. Like as a longtime Mac person, like I am satisfied with his reign, and I think that like he had the impossible task of stepping into Steve Jobs' shoes,
right?
And like he managed that all great. I would say that recently, have I been as enthusiastic about Apple outside of their hardware? No. Like I do love this MacBook, but like also, you know, I haven't like. There hasn't been anything exciting in the iPhone world for a while, and not that I'm even really wanting there to be anything exciting, but it's like, you know, newer camera, it's cool, okay, fine, but like I don't upgrade every year. I upgrade every 2 or 3 years because it's just like not really a reason to do so. And so like I am excited to see what someone more product focused, like Tim was very much like an operator kind of guy, and so he did a good job of like streamlining operations and making sure that all that stuff was working well. But I think the product vision was not. I mean, again, you're following on Steve Jobs. You're just never going to have the same level of product vision that Jobs had. So it's like it's kind of natural for it to be a little less. But I'm like excited for a product guy to be more in charge of Apple stuff and see what he can do in terms of, you know, like Liquid Glass was definitely a little bit of form over function and some other stuff that. And so I'm curious to see like what the future holds.
Although I do think it's interesting because like, I think Tim Cook was definitely just like an operator for sure. That was the thing. He turned Apple from like really from a bankrupt company into a multi-trillion-dollar company, and it became a multi-trillion-dollar company under his reign. But I do think like sometimes the assertion that he's not a product guy, I think falls a little flat for me, because I'm just like, I think it's because the products were so well executed that we all forget how revolutionary they were. Like Apple Watch and AirPods were like, I think, 2 of the most incredible products. AirPods alone, I think, is like probably the most incredible product that Apple has created. Yeah. And I think we forget about it because it is so good and so seamlessly fits into your life that you're like, oh, they're just my headphones. It's like, yeah, but like they're everywhere. But B, I don't think people remember how crappy headphones were before AirPods.
Yeah.
And like they can do crazy stuff now. Like the fact that they are actually hearing aids, and they can do conversation, they can do translation, they can do all of this stuff that like, I mean, maybe some TikTok shop stuff claims that they can do it, but like, or Temu stuff claims that they can do it, but like they can actually do these things that's just like really incredible. And it's just, I think Tim Cook is a product focused guy when the product is fitness stuff. That's really his, like, if it's something about fitness, that's where he's going to be really good. And like, I think people are so used to the hardware, right? The MacBooks and the iPhones and all of that, which did not interest Tim Cook nearly as much. So I think when people say he's not a product guy, it's about those things, right? About those traditional
that's also very fair
tech products, which honestly, like, well, you know, Apple Silicon's great. I'm glad they like set that up. Like that, it does have a very large impact on the world. Still, at the end of the day, I think more like Apple Watch is like the most sold watch in the world. AirPods are a multi-billion-dollar organization on their own, right? They sell so many of them. So it's like those are 2 extremely successful product lines in and of themselves that I think affect people's lives way more than like better iPads or better MacBooks or even better iPhones do.
This is the first MacBook I've owned in many years, and like, but I love my AirPods, and my Apple Watch is 90% good, but because I have the tattoos, it like messes up a little more often than it should, and that's kind of annoying. But it feels like a crapshoot when I buy a new watch if it's gonna like actually stay unlocked or not, which I wouldn't even care that much about, except for the fact that like it pauses. Like I do 5-mile walks semi often, and it'll like pause 45 feet into my hour and a half long exercise period, and I won't notice, and then I'll just miss all that data. It's like, well, ding, like, so but like in general though, it's great. Like, and
like I'd have an Apple Watch if the battery life wasn't so awful. Right. Like it's when you have Garmin watches, you get spoiled because you're used to like a month of battery life, and the Apple Watch Ultra has like 3 days. And it's just like, I don't want to have to charge my watch that much. But I do think I think this transition is really good overall because I think it is time for Apple to switch back to being more of that like hardware, like computer hardware, traditional like MacBooks and desktops and all of that type of company, because it's definitely sorely needed. I think Apple Silicon showed us that. I think the MacBook Neo also showed us that we really need a company that is like Oxide, vertically integrated, does all of the things, can take an old iPhone chip, put it into a MacBook, and have it be like so well selling that even as good at operators as they are, they cannot keep production up because they're like, oh crap, this is way more popular than we thought it would be. I think it's good that like the transition is happening to someone like that. But also, it's not like Tim Cook is like leaving. He's becoming the executive chairman. So he'll still be like paid by Apple. He's just like not the CEO. So it's like John Ternus can still like talk to him and interact with him. I'm sure Tim Cook's still going to have a very big influence in the company for the next probably decade or so. So it's definitely like, it's a change, but it's a much smoother change than the last one, which was just like Steve Jobs. I mean, he did take over before Steve Jobs died, but still, it was just like a crazy thing to have to follow up on.
And also just like, not that Steve Jobs didn't just work all the time, but like he was also distracted with drinking his prune juice instead of taking actual medication. But like he had some stuff going on that like could not mean his full attention was in the transition, whereas Tim is able to do that. And so I think it does help. Like, you're right that there is more meaningful continuity there than there would be in other cases.
All right, so I think that's a good place to end. Any last words before we close out?
I don't know. Give JJ a try. It's cool. It's also still pre 1.0, so we're still making improvements. So if you are too busy like you and don't have time to try it, like just put it in your brain as like something to try in the future, because it'll only get better over time. So I don't know. And I need to try Codex more. I think those are my two takeaways. Is you should try JJ. I should try Codex.
I've been flirting with the idea of getting a OpenAI subscription. I hate Sam Altman so much, but like,
it's terrible.
How much do I actually like Dario? I don't really know. So it's like, it's decisions, tough decisions. But viewer/listener, what do you think about that conversation? Are you gonna try JJ out? Are you gonna get a different AI subscription than the one you currently have? Definitely let us know. As I said, we're really trying to be more active on social media. So please do follow us and reply to our post. I'm trying to get on top of actually replying to y'all so we can actually interact with more than just Changelog Zulip and Go for Slack. But as per usual, you can find your fall through hosts on Changelog Zulip and Go for Slack and social media by mail if you want to mail us something. And in person sometimes too. We're at conferences and stuff. So if you see us, say hi. Otherwise, give us like a nice, send us a nice message. And with that, I think we're done. This episode of Fall Through was hosted by Chris Brando with co-host Steve Klabnik. Fall Through is produced by Chris Brando, and our beats are by Breakmaster Cylinder.